Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
I always tell people that the prosecution took what I call the shotgun approach when it came to establishing a motive. As you'll see throughout this trial, they never really settled on one motive. It was all things like, okay, well, Brandon was failing out of school and did not want to tell his parents, so he shot and killed them. Oh, you don't believe that? Okay, well, did you know that Brandon was gay and didn't want to tell his parents? So he had to shoot them at that point, right? Yes, the prosecution actually presented this theory to the jury, even though they knew just as well as anyone else that Brandon had already told at least his dad, and his dad was very cool about it.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system: the prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Pogensy.
Hello, AJ Army. It's so very good to have you with me this week. If you've made it to this episode, you are a loyal and dedicated general in the American Justice Army, and I'm honored and privileged to serve right along with you. Hairs in her hands. Let's continue on. So Norma Woodruff had what we'll call two sets of hairs in her hands. Her left hand was up behind her head when she was found. By all accounts, she had been that way for a couple of days by the time they found her. At this point, the pooling of the blood had pretty much dried. So when they pulled her left hand away from her head, there was a huge clump of her own hair that came with it. Then, in her right hand, the investigators noted that there were some kind of stray, long blonde hairs woven throughout her fingers. Presumptively, these would have been the hairs of the killer, since Norma had some pretty significant signs of a struggle, especially with her right hand. This might lead you to wonder two things. A, who had long blonde hair? And B, did they test those hairs for DNA? Well, the only people that I know of that had long blonde hair at the time were Norma Etherington and Charla Woodruff. Brandon's hair was very short and had been dyed black at the time for the freshman follies that he was a part of at school. I'm sure that there were more people in the DFW Metroplex that had long blonde hair, but as far as persons of interest to this investigation, those are the only ones that I ever came up with. As far as DNA testing, this will leave us to talk about just one more way that the state of Texas failed Brandon Woodruff. As you heard earlier, the investigators bagged each of Norma's hands separately as to preserve evidence. What happens to them when they get back to the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences for the autopsy? Well, as it turns out, they ended up mixing all of the hairs together. They took all the hairs from the left hand and mixed them together with the hairs from the right hand. So now you have a few, maybe 3 to 5 hairs mixed in with the hundreds and hundreds of hairs from Norma's left hand. They ended up not doing any test on any of the hairs whatsoever. So now it's virtually impossible to tell these hairs from Norma's hair in the big pile from her left hand. As we'll discuss when we talk about the post-conviction relief, getting those hairs separated and tested will not be easy. But one has to assume that if they were able to get those hairs and find out whose they are, we might just have ourselves a legitimate murder suspect. Now, also, if you'll remember from last week, we were right in the middle of the testimony from Detective Joel Gibson from the Hunt County Sheriff's Office. The defense also points out to him an imprint on the empty love seat across from where the Woodruffs were sitting. Their living room was set up such that there were two couches opposite each other. One was a bigger couch that the Woodruffs were located on, and the other was a smaller love seat with a makeshift cardboard box between them acting as a coffee table. So the large dent in the love seat suggests someone had been sitting there for quite a while. The television remotes were also located on that love seat. Who watches television with the remote controls on the empty love seat? So that would lead the normal person to wonder, who was missing? Who was sitting on that couch when the Woodruffs died? Did the investigators do any DNA testing on the remotes? Or look for hairs or DNA on the love seat? Nope, not this investigative team. Detective Gibson then goes on to verify that Norma Etherington called the sheriff's office with information about the crime before a press release had even hit the media. This, too, was never investigated and never questioned. Katherine Ferguson grills Detective Gibson on why the barn wasn't thoroughly searched regardless of, quote, clutter. I mean, after all, wasn't this a capital murder case? Shouldn't the investigators use every method at their disposal to search the crime scene? Even if that means using a broom and a trash bag. He was simply following orders from his superiors without taking his own initiative. I always wondered if Joel Gibson realizes that his apathy helped put an innocent man in prison. Oh well, as long as he can sleep at night. Next up, Brent Chambers takes the stand. Mr. Chambers is a special agent with the FBI. He was the one that searched Brandon's Dodge pickup. He didn't really have much to say other than the fact that he personally applied luminol and found no traces of blood. But I thought it was a really bloody crime scene. Oh well, witness dismissed. Now, Lindsey Ferguson takes the stand. She's now a senior at ACU. She basically paints Brandon as a liar, since she assumed that he was a rich kid and his parents were murdered in a double-wide mobile home. Damn it. And he would have gotten away with it if it weren't for those uppity, speculative kids, right, Scooby? When people ask me how in the world Brandon got convicted, I point to witnesses like this. It's no secret that Brandon had been a little bit of a braggart when he was at school. He was meeting all of those people for the first time, and he wanted to portray himself as a rich kid, just like them. Most of the people that go to ACU are pretty well off. It's a private university, and it costs a pretty penny. Their tuition at the time was almost $50,000 a year. And unless you had a scholarship or some grant money like Brandon did, This was most definitely a college where the uppity Christian parents preferred to send their kids. So I can imagine that Brandon, being of the social status that he was, felt the urge to embellish his lifestyle a little bit. But this goes right back to how Brandon was convicted. The witness is just one more example of someone that had absolutely nothing of relevance to the case or the murder itself, other than to say that Brandon was a big fat liar because he wasn't as rich as he said he was. Pure character assassination. This is how Brandon Woodruff was convicted with no evidence, ladies and gentlemen. Character assassination. All right, so here comes Brandon Bobbitt, Videographer of the Year for 2005. He was in charge of the evidence collection and storage. He also helped with the search in the barn, but claimed that it was too cluttered to search thoroughly. Brooms and ladders, obviously, were not in the Hunt County budget that year. Next came Neal Martin, a blood spatter expert from Smith County who, until 9 a.m. that morning, the defense had no idea that he would be offering testimony. Due to this, he testified to his qualifications outside of the jury presence. His testimony was objected to by the defense, but overruled by the court. He testifies to a lot of technical jargon, but ultimately he says there was blood found at the crime scene. A lot of it. Like, all over the place. As my parents used to say, no shit, Sherlock. I love it when C. Derek puts stuff like that in there. All right, so that rounds out day 3. Up next, day 4. The state of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff, Court Reporter Volume 43. Joe Rasco takes the stand. He was a homicide special cold case expert from Smith County. Since he worked hand in hand with the previous witness, we get a lot of the same testimony and experiences. He also verified that no one in the initial investigation team wore foot protection and no doorknobs or light switches were checked for blood. Next, Brandon's college friend Eric Gentry was called to the stand. It's the standard, quote, cowboy-turned-model discussion. He, too, was under the impression that Brandon's family was loaded and shocked to know that they were killed in a double-wide mobile home in Royce City, Texas. Now, to Brandon's credit, and even a little bit to Eric's credit, the Woodruffs had lived in a fairly nice house in a fairly nice neighborhood until just a month or two before the murders. Brandon and Eric had known each other for a few years at this point, so the fact that Dennis and Norma moved to a mobile home and Brandon did not immediately go running to all of his friends to inform them of this was completely understandable. However, Eric confirmed that it seemed as though most of Brandon's college friends, quote, assumed that the family was wealthy and that Brandon was a heterosexual male. Not because of what Brandon was saying, but more because of how he acted. As we talked about earlier in the season, Brandon would do things like go to the mall and buy something for all of his friends on his credit card. So people just kind of assumed that he came from a family that had money. Assumed. Then, the prosecution asks Eric about Brandon's money. Mr. Gentry says that it was his impression that it was because of Brandon's new job. Of course, Katherine Ferguson hops out of her chair like one of those whack-a-mole games and immediately requests a bench conference with the judge. She tells the judge that she feels like the prosecution is about to get into the gay porn that Brandon had done. The defense battled this repeatedly throughout the trial because it would instantly destroy Brandon's image in the eyes of this small-town conservative jury. Ultimately, Mr. Guerrero assured the judge that he had a conversation with Mr. Gentry just to let him know that he was not going to get into the gay porn, but would only talk about the modeling that Brandon had been doing. All right, the questioning continues. And this now brings up something that I promised you last week that we would talk about. Remember Eric's description of the dagger that Brandon owned when he was talking to Ranger Collins just 2 weeks after the murders? Well, turns out that Eric now identified this almost 2-foot sword as the one that he was talking about. Now you might wonder to yourself how that is. This gets into a very technical and detailed description, but I feel that it's very, very important that we all understand it. After all, this was probably the number one reason that the jury felt comfortable attributing this sword to Brandon. Don't worry, I'll do my best to summarize it as briefly as possible. Okay, so it all comes down to a meeting that Mr. Gentry had with the prosecution about 2 weeks before trial. They sat down with him to show him a picture of the sword that they had recovered. Yes, you heard that right. They showed him a picture of it. They didn't bring out the actual sword, just a photograph of it. The problem with this is that the picture that they showed him was on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. Remember the description that Eric gave? 6 to 7 inches on the blade and 4 to 5 inches on the handle.
How big was the dagger?
Probably,
of
6.
the blade, 6
The
inches.
blade
you
was
think?
probably 6-7 inches, and then the handle 4 or 5.
That means it's anywhere from 10 to 12 inches long. Well, guess what is right in the middle of 10 and 12? Yep, 11. So when the prosecution shows him this picture, he's thinking, okay, it's about 11 inches long and it fit on this piece of paper, so looks like it to me. After all, it had been almost 4 years since he had seen it, and to his admission, he only saw it like once or twice. Now, you might be wondering, what is so wrong about showing Mr. Gentry a picture of the sword? Well, they actually did 2 things wrong. First, they showed him a much smaller version of the sword, which made it look much more like a dagger instead of this huge sword that it was. And secondly, they only showed him that one picture. Imagine what would have happened if they brought out an array of 6 different types of medieval swords and asked him, "Can you identify which one you saw in Brandon's closet?" I'm going to go out on a limb and say he probably would not have picked out this one. Now, I don't want you to take my word for it. In part of my investigation into this case, I actually contacted a very well-respected expert in the field, Dr. Ronald Fisher. Dr. Fisher is the head of the Department of Psychology at the Florida International University. Dr. Fisher's research work and area of specialty is focused on witness misidentification. He does a lot of work on why witnesses misidentify things. In working on this case together, and specifically this witness, the following is the email that I got from Dr. Fisher summing up our work. Scott, depending on what the prosecution's office said to this witness, who changed his answer about the length of the alleged weapon, the prosecution violated one of the recommendations of the U.S. Justice Department of how to collect information from witnesses. In any case, the prosecution's showing of a picture of a knife to the witness would easily account for the witness's changed answer. As described before, this is one of my areas of specialty, as I was one of the members of the Justice Department's committee that put together these recommendations. So there you have it from an independent source. from someone who was on the committee establishing the Department of Justice recommendations for preparing witnesses. So then, after they show him a picture of this scaled-down sword and he identifies it, you can only imagine what happened when they showed the actual sword to him in court. The funny thing about when the prosecution did this was that it was like real quick. Like they asked him all kinds of questions about it and where Brandon showed it to him and how many times he saw it, etc., etc. Then when they asked him to identify it, they held it up from across the room. And as soon as he said, "Yeah, that's it," they put it away real quick and they ended their questioning and passed the witness. There was no like, "Here, Eric, hold it in your hand. Does this now feel like the dagger that you held back then?" or anything like that. It was just, "Hey, over here from across the room. Is this it? Yep, okay, pass the witness." Honestly, it was just comical. But don't worry, Katherine Ferguson wouldn't let it slide that easy. All right, here's how that went down. We'll start with Miss Ferguson. Okay, now, do you recall talking about the dagger to the Rangers and describing it back in 2005? Eric says yes. Katherine, do you remember telling them that it was only about a foot long? Eric says yes. Katherine, and the blade was only about 6 inches long? Eric says yes. Then Katherine says, and that the knife was overall only about a foot long? Eric says yes. Katherine then says, do you think you were pretty accurate in your description? And Eric says, well, as I look at it now, it looks a little bigger. Katherine says, it looks a lot bigger, doesn't it? Eric says, it looks bigger. Katherine says, doesn't that look more like the blade's over about a foot long, like over a foot long? Eric says, I will trust that the blade is going to be 9 inches. Katherine says, okay, you're not good at guesstimating lengths. Is that what you're saying? Eric says yes. And then Katherine comes back and says, okay, were you ever shown a picture of that knife by anyone from the state before you came in to testify here today? And Eric says, yes. So needless to say that Eric's description of the dagger and his identification of the sword here at trial were at complete odds with each other. And now we know why. Because the prosecution violated the Department of Justice's guidelines on preparing witnesses. I hate to keep saying it, but it's not surprising. All right. So next, Michelle Lee takes the stand. Finally, a name we all know. She says that Brandon dated her daughter Morgan off and on again. She described Brandon as a cowboy who turned GQ. That's okay, Michelle. We describe you as a gun enthusiast turned art collector. She verified that the art/gun was missing and that she paid for Brandon's charter flight from Abilene to Dallas. She found it odd that Brandon wasn't snotting everywhere when he cried because that's how she cries. Wait, are we all supposed to cry the same? Damn, I hope not. I have a tendency to growl when I cry. Scares the hell out of anyone around me. Okay, those were C. Derek's words, not mine. When I cry, I tend to sit there silently while tears just stream down my face. Well, according to Michelle Lee, though, we're all going to have to learn to cry differently. So she then says that she drove Brandon to be with his family in Texakarna and then followed them all to the Hunt County Sheriff's Office on the following day to find out what she could regarding Dennis and Norma's murders. She contacted the Sheriff's Office on the following day and took to them the empty gun/art holster. After that, she and Morgan again traveled to Texakarna to be part of the funeral. She also verified that Mike and the other shit kickers had access to the gun/art a few weekends prior to the murders. All right, well, that about wraps it up for day 4. Here comes Day 5. State of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff. Court Reporter, Volume 44. Michelle Lee continues on into the next day of trial. She repeats that the shit kickers had access to the missing gun before leaving for a trip to the Lee's family cabin in Oklahoma. She also admitted that her family rarely paid any attention to the gun/art on the wall, so it could have been taken before the weekend in question. I don't know why she had to be called the next day. It seems like she could have just been kept for another 5 minutes the day before, just to reiterate things that she's already said. But here we are. All right, next, Adrienne Ling, another Lindsey, L-I-N-G-E. Why do I always have so much problem with her name? Adrienne Lingy, another ACU student who knew Brandon for a few weeks, took the stand to repeat what the other students had stated. Remember that? It was all still very early in Brandon's freshman year in college. Most of these students only interacted with Brandon for a few weeks before he was arrested for his parents' murders. How well can you get to know someone in just a few weeks? Speculation and assumption ran rampant every time one of these so-called friends took the stand. Again, Brandon was supposedly rich, dressed like a model, and was receiving a new truck from his parents. The damn truck again. She never paid any special attention to the, quote, dagger that Brandon kept in his dorm room closet and could not identify it. Tom Cruise, another ACU student who also claimed to know Brandon, took the stand. He was of no relevance and again, not related to Tom Cruise, like that Tom Cruise. He did not take those old records off the shelf and did not feel the need for speed. He exhibited pure speculation on Brandon's character and, like Miss Lingy, never knew anything about the dagger. All right, next, Michelle Stern from the Texas Attorney General's office paid the witness stand a visit at this point. She was the officer who drove the routes and compiled the phone records. We've beaten this information like a dead horse. Some of the phone records were not subpoenaed, and some of them included were not relevant to the case, so it was impossible to get a full, proper picture. Or so she said. She researched the routes taken in the timeline in 2009, but had no knowledge of any construction or detours that may have been present in 2005. She also had no idea of which routes Brandon took from the Heath residence to Denny's. There's a lot of them to choose from. For the record, when we marked out Brandon's timeline in earlier episodes, we used the quickest routes. If Brandon took any other route that was slower, that just cuts his 14 minutes down even less. All right, so Robert Martinez finally graced us with his presence in the courtroom. He lived in the same dorm room as Brandon and traveled from Abilene to Dallas with him on the weekend in question. Robert did not own a car at ACU and had to bum rides from his friends to be able to see his girlfriend in Denton on the weekends. He knew early in the weekend that the two of them would be traveling back to Abilene in the new truck because Brandon had told him long before the Sunday in question. Oh no. Are we blowing the prosecution's theory to hell that Brandon had to kill his parents just so his mom would let him drive that truck? Oops, sorry about that. Okay. So again, Robert claimed that Brandon told him during a phone conversation that Saturday he'd had sex with Morgan and considered it to be a, quote, bad thing. No one ever elaborated on why having sex with Morgan was bad. Perhaps we can ask her when it's her turn to speak. On Sunday, the decision was made to meet Brandon halfway to his location rather than having Brandon pick him up in Denton. He claimed Brandon was breathing funny on the phone. Heavy. like out of breath. Robert met Alex for the first time and agreed to go to the gay bar rather than go directly back to ACU. He claimed he wasn't really friends with Brandon. He was just hitching a ride to Dallas and back. Damn, talk about bad luck. This was the hitchhiking trip that kept giving for many years to come. Morgan Lee finally takes the stand. Rockwall County's undeniable sweetheart, right? Brandon's girlfriend from high school and beyond. Morgan immediately claims on the record that she has a bad memory. She flat out says this in the court transcript. She and Brandon only saw each other a few times in the 8 weeks since he'd begun college in Abilene. He brought her breakfast that weekend and they traveled to Waco to get a lamb. They left Brandon's white Dodge at the Heath home and continued to Waco in Morgan's truck. She claimed that after they returned to her house, the two of them were separated for 40 to 45 minutes while she showered. They ate Chick-fil-A in Brandon's parents' blue Toyota Camry, met some friends, aka Magic Mike Etherington, and he took her home around 11. This was all Saturday night. Pay special attention to what she just said about Mike and Brandon seeing each other that night at Chick-fil-A. That will come up significantly in our wrap-up show. Morgan went on to say that she had no idea about Brandon coming into town on previous weekends to hang out with his, quote, secret friends in Plano. She swore the two of them were never sexually active, not even on the weekend where Brandon mentioned doing so on the phone to Robert. She insists that the shit-kicker crew had indeed been inside of her home without her parents present, and that they had access to the missing gun/art prior to the discovery of its absence. She also claims that Brandon didn't like guns and had minimal knowledge of them. Just to make an interesting note at this point, a statement is made during an objection that stands out. Judge Beacom says, "What does being gay have to do with whether or not Brandon committed capital murder?" Exactly, Your Honor. Exactly. Too bad everyone else in the courtroom didn't agree with you. Morgan begins to stumble when asked if Etherington or the other male friends had ever stayed the night with her in their home. She asks, "What's the big deal?" My answer? A gun was stolen, Morgan, and they're blaming the guy who is on trial. That's the big deal. She also said that the Lees rarely locked their home and that all of her friends knew that. So what she's saying here is that her house is rarely locked, all of her friends knew it, and that anyone had access to that house whenever they weren't home. Okay, sounds interesting. Again, just solidifying the fact that anyone had access to the missing gun/art. All right, day 5 then comes to a close. All right, here we are with day 6. State of Texas versus Brandon Dale Woodruff, Court Reporter, Volume 45. Alex Rulli, Brandon's, quote, secret friend from Plano, takes the stand. He claimed that he had met Brandon over the summer of 2005 through some mutual friends and that they had dated for a while. He claimed that Brandon came back to the Dallas area often to hang out with him and to go to the Station 4 dance club. He'd never heard of Morgan Lee. As far as he was concerned, Brandon lived a homosexual lifestyle and didn't have a girlfriend. Brandon and Alex were together on the night of the murders, and the toll records back this up. He describes the suitcase incident that we had discussed in previous episodes and claims that Brandon said that he and Charla would be well taken care of because of some of the insurance policies. Alex admits to being off on his earlier reported times by about an hour. He agreed that Brandon's explanation for freaking out over the suitcase was reasonable. He had things in there that he didn't want Robert to see pertaining to his secret homosexual lifestyle. After all, ACU is a Church of Christ organization and despises homosexuality. Other than the suitcase incident, Brandon was completely normal on that Sunday night in question, according to Rulli. Now, I'd like to interject here just real quick to add a personal note. I did not know Alex Rulli when all of this went down, but I did know of him. He was pretty popular in the gay world in Dallas, and a good friend of mine named Dan knew Alex. It's amazing when you start thinking about different people and how many connections you have through a friend of a friend. What's the game? 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon or something like that? Yeah, seems like we're all connected in one way or another. Anyway, by all accounts from those that knew him, Alex was a pretty troubled individual. He ended up contracting HIV and ultimately, for whatever reason, stopped taking his treatments for it. I'm not sure if it was depression or what happened, but by all accounts from those that knew him, they always said that Alex was a great and fun-loving guy that would help anyone in need. He ended up dying way too young in 2013 at the age of 29. All right, so next, Alex's friend, James Britt, came to the stand and backed him up 100%. He verified Alex's story and that he and Brandon were dating at some point, but not on the night in question. He also speaks of the suitcase freakout, but thought it was validated as well. Next, the state called Randal Lunz to the stand. If you recall, he was the Woodruffs' neighbor for 9 years in Heath. He remembers seeing Brandon and Morgan twice on that Saturday and explains his Sunday night routine. He heard a noise next door at the Woodruff home and noticed Brandon on the driveway. He thought nothing of it and went back to bed. When he awoke the next morning, he saw Brandon's truck in the driveway and Norma's truck was gone. He heard about the murders on the news and in the paper the following week. He contacted law enforcement to make a statement. Oddly enough, as we covered, he couldn't even remember Dennis, Norma, or Charla's first name when Ranger Collins interviewed him, even though he lived next door to them for 9 years.
What was the purpose for you calling? Why did you call? What made you decide that you needed to call?
What made me decide I needed to call was I can't even remember their name, I'm sorry.
Dennis
and
Norma?
Woodruff.
Okay.
Now, in court, he claimed to forget things when he got nervous. This would have been valuable information to know 3 years prior to the trial. All right. Now it's Deputy Marshal Kirk King's turn to take the stand to round out day 6 of the trial. He's a cell phone tower expert who quickly learns all about his lack of expertise at the hands of defense attorney Katherine Ferguson. They used the information provided by Sprint to log Charla's whereabouts. Well, at least the whereabouts of Charla's phone. That phone spent most of the day in Texakarna. Then, later that night, the phone heads eastbound on Highway 82. Then, it spends the night in Magnolia, Arkansas. He goes on to verify Morgan's, Robert's, and Brandon's whereabouts according to their phone records. It verifies everything that we've discussed in previous episodes when we go to the above-mentioned board. The records only show calls for one particular carrier, though, and not all calls from other phone carriers who were available in 2005. As a matter of fact, the state's cell records do not coincide with the records taken from Dennis and Norma's caller ID as logged by the Hunt County Sheriff's Office. Deputy King claims that he can only verify his facts with the information that AT&T provided him. The defense points out and verifies that several calls are missing from the list. King, the quote expert witness, agrees that the phone records are incomplete. Here's a little preview from next week when we talk to John Miner. He was the expert that testified in trial about the phone records. So we'll talk all about the phone records. Brandon's, Charla's, Mike's, Dusty, everybody's. And we're going to find out and we're going to get to the bottom of why were Brandon's phone records missing. You will not want to miss this. Don't worry, we'll start the episode off with it. But here's just a little sneak peek. Until then, remember to stay aware, stay strong, and get involved. We'll see you next week.
Some of the evidence that I looked at was actually created by law enforcement. It looks like they received something from a mobile network operator legal compliance department, and then they created their own spreadsheets or whatever from that information. So we really don't know what they may have modified, whether they tailored the evidence to fit the crime or whether they just simply were blundering along. But in any event, it would be very normal for that type of evidence to be precluded from admission in a case. Any other type of evidence would be precluded.